Thank you all. It's good to see so many students here. Very nice to be with you. I have to thank Jaka for his kind words. Though we're from the same state, it doesn't mean that he's particularly soft in his questioning of me, as you'll probably see afterwards. But he's been very kind in giving me a distinction I haven't yet quite earned, because having won 3 times, I'm not yet the only one to do that, because I did have a distinguished predecessor, a man called A. Charles, who was a 3-term MP, except that 2 of those terms were less than 5 years, because in the 90s we had to have these somewhat short-lived parliaments. So I think he served cumulatively just under 12 years in his 3 terms. So assuming that if I last the full term, then I'll be the longest serving MP for Thiruvananthapuram. But it's striking, though, that in Kerala we don't have a habit of re-electing our politicians very much. So we have a record in India that for the last 60 years or 55 years, every single state government, without exception, has been defeated and replaced by the opposition. And after 5 years, the opposition has been defeated and replaced by the new opposition. This is how it goes. It's been alternation of governments, because Keralite voters are very impatient with their representatives, which is why I shouldn't spend too much time here. I should be back in Parliament representing them. But let me accept the very kind invitation of my friend Vijay Darda, who is himself a parliamentarian as well as a publisher and editor, to say a few words to you about the importance of regional parties in our country, because it's quite an interesting phenomenon. You know, when I was a kid, a bit younger perhaps than all of you were, there was no such serious phenomenon. The politics were all national. The Congress Party was a giant instrument which had a presence in every state, every district, possibly every village. It was partially a legacy of the national movement, but also of the fact that even after independence, people with political aspirations tended to join it. And the very few alternatives that existed also claimed to be national. So you had the Communist Party of India, which later broke into 2, but they both sought to have a national footprint, a very strong base in the labor unions. There was the Socialist Party, which also claimed to be national and did indeed at various stages have a presence in every state in India. And there was also those were the Socialists, the Communists, and the Congress were at that point the main national parties. And then the legendary Rajaji broke away from the Congress in 1959 to found the Swatantra, but that too was a national party that put up candidates pretty much around the country. So what changed? What changed really began with the 1967 elections. You may be surprised, those of you grown up in an India where every 6 months there's an election in some state or the other, that in those days, the 1952, 57, 62, and 67 elections all took place the way Mr. Modi wants it, one nation, one election, one time. That is, that you had a general election, state assembly elections, panchayat elections, everything at the same time. On the same day, people would go with the ballot and they would just have different ballot boxes for the different candidates there to elect, because all the state governments were stable Congress governments, had lasted the full 5 years, and so was the central government. But in 67, there were the first rumblings of discontent, and you had a number of opposition parties gaining enough seats to be able to form coalition governments that then replaced the Congress. We call the Samyukt Vidhayak Dal governments, SVD, which were coalitions in many, many states. And in Tamil Nadu, a regional party, the DMK, for the first time defeated the Congress and formed the government. And from then on, there was no looking back. You've seen 2 things happening to create regional parties. One is, of course, the gradual disintegration of the big national parties, the Congress Party above all, which found many, many, many offshoots emerging from it, sometimes bearing Congress in their names. By the late 1990s, you had the Nationalist Congress Party, you had the Trinamool Congress Party, you had the Tamil Manila Congress Party. All of these had been led by people who were members of the Congress, but who broke away and formed regional parties, and they all had a strong regional base, which is why the regionally strong leaders decided they can do better without a national party. And the communists broke up, they became essentially confined to Bengal and Kerala. as the power of labor unions waned in other traditional strongholds of theirs, like Bombay and Bihar. Then you had the Mandalization phenomenon, when the backward classes found through the Mandal agitation for reservations for the OBCs an opportunity to form credible political vehicles of their own. These vehicles initially spanned, for example, most of North India, but then very quickly broke up. And they broke up into very specific subcaste and regional identities, so that you think of three different Yadavs. You'll think of Lalu Prasad Yadav very much as a Bihar regional leader of the backward castes. You think of Mulayam Singh Yadav as a UP regional leader of the backward castes plus Muslim community. And you'll think of Sharad Yadav as a leader with, of course, slightly more national interests across the Hindi belt, but now identified very much with one different faction of the JDU. And now Nitish Kumar has his own faction of the JDU, and that's, he's not a Yadav, but nonetheless you've got one more party representing particularist interests of the backward classes. Now with all of this, what you're seeing is essentially the breakup of national, or at least aspirationally national forces. But in addition, you also had the rise of purely regional parties whose roots were in one state and whose entire purpose for existence was to actually articulate the aspirations, the identity, and the specific needs of that state. So you have the DMK in Tamil Nadu and its offshoot, the ADMK. You have the Telugu Desam party in Andhra Pradesh. You now have the YSR Congress in Andhra Pradesh, also breaking away from the Congress party. You have the Shiv Sena in Maharashtra. So you can find example after example of parties that essentially function in one state. Nominally, they may have an office in some other state, but they have no credible political presence other than in the one state. And you identify the DMK as a Tamil Nadu party. So either you started off with a national party and broke up, or you started at the grassroots and began as a regional party, but either way, your focus tends to be on states. And now what's happened, therefore, is that the country has been left with only two truly national parties. I think the Election Commission recognizes five. It still recognizes the CPI, CPM, and NCP as national parties. But that's because in the previous election, they had won seats in 3 states. Now they haven't, so I suspect they will lose that status. There's some requirement in the Election Commission to be called a national party after a presence everywhere. But now you're ending up in a situation in which most of the country is represented through regional parties, and the 2 national parties are essentially the BJP and the Congress. The Congress increasingly working with regional parties in alliance. The BJP, having done that in the past, now feels it doesn't need them so much, and that's the political reality. So I've given you a quick survey. Let me give you a few numbers, since you're students, you must have a good head for numbers. In the first Lok Sabha election in 1952, of the 55 parties that contested, 18 had only a regional base. That went up to 36 in the 2004 election. In the 2014 election, if you look at who all won and sent MPs to Parliament, 31 regional parties were represented in the Parliament. It's very slightly lower now, I think it's 29 or 28 in this Parliament. But regional parties, therefore, because they often have just 1 or 2 members, cannot be ignored, but they are often fairly small in their impact in the House. Now, again, to look at vote share, as recently as 1984, regional parties got a total in the entire country of just 11.2% of the votes. But by 2009, that had gone up to 28.4%. And in every election since 84, the vote share of the regional parties has increased. Today, in the 17th Lok Sabha, we have 145 MPs in the Lok Sabha who are only from regional parties. That's despite the BJP having 303 and the Congress having 52. You've got 145 from purely regional parties. Now, the Election Commission recognizes 53 regional parties. That's not a small number, as you can imagine. And that doesn't mean they're represented in Parliament, but the Election Commission allots them a symbol that nobody else can use, and that has a certain resonance and meaning across the country. And regional parties are in power in 10 of our states. So they're often not in power alone, they're in power in coalition, such as Nitish Kumar is in coalition with the BJP in Bihar, but say YSR Congress does not need a coalition in Andhra Pradesh. Or the Telangana Rashtra Samiti, TRS in Hyderabad, they don't need a coalition with anyone. But otherwise, it's quite common to have regional parties as part of a coalition with a larger national party, or in some cases, as more than just a small presence, they can actually be a leading figure in a national party. To give you an example, the last time that the Congress party was in power in Kerala, in the assembly of 140, the coalition had 71 or 72. And in that 72, the Congress had just about over 30, and a purely regional party, the Muslim League, had 21. So you can see that the difference between the size of the national party and that of the regional party in the coalition is not that significant. Now, I'm going to try and conclude this by just giving you a couple of observations. One would argue that, one could have argued at one time what a pity it is that the country has all these regional parties, or the national parties should represent the interests of the whole nation, and these people have narrower interests. But the truth is, in many ways, it's facilitated the decentralization of power and, as a result, deepened India's democracy. Because let us not forget that in a country like India, which is as large as it is, physically and in terms of population, 1.3 billion people, that it becomes extremely difficult to make every decision affecting Dharwad or Dibrugarh in Delhi. You should actually have more authority going to the states, and the regional parties therefore represent state interests more effectively. And I would argue that it's part in many ways of the democratic evolution of India's polity that we have the growing strength and increasing impact of regional parties. I would argue that the regions need attention from the center, but a national party sometimes puts its own national perspective ahead of the local party's direct interests, whereas a local regional party very often articulates and defends and puts forward the interests of the state with much more passion and conviction, because for them it's the most important issue, whereas for any national party there can be 20 other issues. So imagine if you had a national party ruling in Bengal and the Prime Minister had concluded an agreement with the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, do you think that a national party like the BJP, if it were ruling in Bengal, would have been able to obstruct that agreement by citing the Tista River waters and refusing to agree? Yet Mamata Banerjee was able to do that. So you see that you have a situation in which a regional party will often look at a local issue differently from a national party in power in a state. So I'll stop there because Zaka says he has some questions and possibly you have some questions, but that gives you a broad overview of the larger opportunities, challenges and evolution of regional parties in our politics. Thanks very much and Jai Hind.